"You'll be safer out here," my fiancé said as she stepped back toward her SUV. My mother was right. You just need time away from everyone. Those were the last words Emily Brooks spoke to me before the dust from her tires swallowed the narrow dirt road and left me standing alone in the middle of a forgotten ranch in eastern Montana. I watched her taillights disappear beyond a line of cottonwood trees until there was nothing left except silence and the endless stretch of open land. For several seconds, I honestly believed she would come back. Maybe she had forgotten something. Maybe this was some terrible misunderstanding. Maybe she would realize that leaving a man recovering from a serious illness more than 50 miles from the nearest town made no sense at all. But the road stayed empty. The only sound was the dry wind brushing across the tall grass and the distant creak of an old wooden fence. My name is Nathan Carter. 6 months earlier, my life looked completely different. I had a steady engineering job in Denver, a downtown apartment, friends who filled every holiday with laughter, and a wedding planned for early October. Emily and I had spent nearly 3 years building what I believed was an honest future together. We had picked out invitations, sampled wedding cakes, argued playfully over first dance songs, and even laughed about which one of us would cry first during the ceremony. If someone had told me then that the woman I loved would one day leave me alone on an isolated ranch because someone else told her it was the right thing to do, I would have laughed and said they had the wrong couple. Then everything changed. A serious illness arrived without warning and turned my carefully organized life upside down. Recovery was slow. Some mornings, simply walking across my apartment felt like climbing a steep hill. My doctors remained optimistic, reminding me that healing took patience, but patience was becoming harder to find. Emily visited less often. At first she blamed work, then traffic, then family obligations. Eventually, every conversation somehow circled back to her mother, Patricia Brooks. Patricia always had an opinion about my treatment, my future, and whether Emily deserved a life tied to someone facing months of recovery. I tried not to let those comments bother me. Family's worried. Mother's worried. I kept telling myself that love would outlast fear. A week earlier, Emily surprised me with what sounded like the perfect idea. She said a family friend owned a peaceful ranch where I could rest, breathe fresh air, and regain my strength without the noise of the city. She smiled the way she used to smile before everything became complicated. I wanted to believe her. Maybe I needed to believe her. So I packed one suitcase, my medications, a few paperbacks, and the framed picture from our engagement that had always sat beside my bed. The drive lasted nearly 6 hours. We spoke very little. Every time I tried starting a conversation, Emily tightened her grip on the steering wheel and answered with only a few words. By the time we reached the ranch, the afternoon sun hung low across the fields, painting everything gold while somehow making the place feel even lonelier. The old farmhouse stood quietly behind rows of weathered fencing, its wide porch casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. Emily carried my suitcase onto the porch without looking me in the eyes. She handed me a small envelope containing my medication schedule and a spare key. Then she delivered the sentence I will never forget. "Mom says this is where you'll be safest." She climbed back into her SUV before I could ask what she really meant. I stood there holding the key in one hand and the engagement photo in the other, finally understanding that sometimes the person who walks away doesn't slam the door. Sometimes they simply convince themselves they're doing the right thing, leaving you alone to wonder whether the life you believed in had already disappeared long before they drove away. I stood on the porch for several minutes before I finally reached for the old brass doorknob. The front door opened with a slow creak, revealing a farmhouse that smelled faintly of cedar, coffee, and years of quiet living. It was cleaner than I expected. Someone clearly cared for the place. A handmade quilt rested neatly across a worn leather sofa. Family photographs lined the fireplace mantel, although every frame showed people I had never met. A cast-iron stove stood in the corner beside a neatly stacked pile of firewood. Whoever lived here believed in preparation. I carried my suitcase inside, closed the door behind me, and listened. The silence was almost overwhelming. Back in Denver, there had always been traffic, distant sirens, neighbors walking through apartment hallways, or someone laughing outside a coffee shop. Here there was only the steady ticking of an old grandfather clock and the wind brushing against the windows. I reached for my phone, hoping to call Emily before she got too far down the road. The screen displayed a single weak bar that disappeared before the call could even begin. I walked from one room to another searching for a stronger signal, raising my arm near windows and standing on the back porch, but nothing lasted more than a few seconds. My messages remained unsent. I told myself not to panic. Maybe the reception was simply unreliable. Maybe she would call me first once she reached the highway. I unpacked the medications my doctor had carefully organized into labeled containers. The supply would last only a little over 2 weeks before I needed another refill. Emily knew that. She had been sitting beside me during every appointment. She had listened as my physician explained the schedule, the follow-up tests, and the importance of staying connected in case anything changed. The thought settled heavily in my mind, but I pushed it aside. There had to be an explanation that made sense. Just as I finished placing my medicine on the kitchen counter, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, steady, deliberate footsteps crossed the porch before a gentle knock echoed through the house. When I opened the door, I found an older man standing there with a weathered canvas hat in one hand and a toolbox in the other. His silver hair peeked out beneath the brim, and deep lines framed kind blue eyes that seemed to notice everything without saying much. "You must be Nathan," he said. "I am Walter Hayes. I own this ranch." I introduced myself, embarrassed that he had found me staring into empty fields instead of getting settled. Walter smiled politely, but studied my face for a moment longer than most people would. "Long drive?" he asked. I nodded. "Long enough." He looked toward the dusty road where Emily had disappeared. "Your ride left in a hurry." His words were simple, yet something about the way he said them made me pause. "She had somewhere she needed to be," I answered, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Walter did not challenge me. Instead, he stepped inside long enough to check the kitchen sink, tightened a loose faucet with practiced hands, and explained that he lived in a smaller cabin about half a mile away. The farmhouse had been empty for several years except for occasional visitors looking for peace and quiet. Before leaving, he handed me a folded sheet of paper with emergency numbers written neatly across the front. "The landline works better than cell phones around here," he said. "If you need anything, call me, day or night." I thanked him, and he tipped his hat before walking back toward the barn. I watched him disappear beyond a line of old oak trees, feeling strangely reassured by his calm presence. That evening, I heated a can of soup I had packed for the trip and sat alone at the kitchen table. The engagement photograph remained beside my plate. Emily's smile in the picture looked warm, hopeful, completely different from the distant expression she wore during the drive. I searched every memory from the past few months, trying to identify the exact moment everything had begun slipping away. Had it started after my diagnosis? Had Patricia quietly influenced every decision? Or had I simply refused to see what was happening because accepting the truth would have hurt too much? As darkness settled over the ranch, the stars appeared brighter than any I had seen in years. They filled the Montana sky from one horizon to the other, beautiful enough to make anyone forget the loneliness below them. My phone remained silent. No call, no message, no explanation. Somewhere beyond those endless fields, the woman I planned to marry was driving farther away, while for the first time a quiet question entered my mind, not whether she would come back, but whether she had ever intended to. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because the unfamiliar silence made every small sound seem louder than it really was. The farmhouse slowly came to life as pale morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the old pine floor. I brewed a pot of coffee using the supplies Walter had quietly stocked in the pantry. The rich aroma filled the room, offering a brief sense of comfort that reminded me of ordinary mornings back home. I reached for my phone again out of habit. The screen remained empty. No missed calls, no text messages, nothing from Emily, nothing from anyone. It felt as though I had quietly disappeared from the world without anyone noticing. After breakfast, I decided to walk around the property. My strength had improved slightly after a full night of rest, although every step still reminded me that recovery was far from over. The ranch stretched farther than I had realized the day before. Rolling fields spread toward distant hills where fences seemed to disappear into the horizon. A weathered red barn stood beside several empty horse pens, while an old windmill turned slowly under the clear Montana sky. Everything looked peaceful, almost timeless, Yet there was an unmistakable feeling that the land had witnessed countless stories before mine. As I rounded the side of the barn, I found Walter repairing a section of fencing with careful, practiced movements. He greeted me with a warm smile and handed me a bottle of cold water before I even asked. "You are looking steadier today," he said. I thanked him and admitted that I still felt uncertain about everything. Walter leaned against the fence post and studied the open pasture for several quiet moments before speaking again. "Sometimes the hardest part of recovery is not your body," he said. "It is figuring out who stayed beside you when life stopped being convenient." His words settled heavily in my mind because they sounded less like advice and more like experience. We spent the next hour walking slowly across the ranch while he introduced me to the property. He pointed out the vegetable garden, the equipment shed, and a small fishing pond hidden behind a cluster of cottonwood trees. The fresh air eased the tightness in my chest, and for the first time in weeks I felt something close to calm. Yet that calm disappeared the moment Walter stopped walking and looked toward the long gravel driveway. "Can I ask you something?" he said gently. "Of course." He hesitated just long enough for me to realize he had been debating whether to say anything at all. "Your fiancée? Emily. Has she ever been here before?" I frowned. "Not that I know of. She told me this place belonged to a family friend." Walter slowly shook his head. "No, I have never met her until last week." My heartbeat quickened. "Last week?" He nodded. "She drove out here with another woman. I assume it was her mother." They asked detailed questions about the farmhouse, the phone service, the nearest pharmacy, and how often I checked on guests staying here. I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. "Are you sure it was Emily?" Walter walked into the barn and returned carrying a clipboard with several visitor records attached to it. He turned a few pages before pointing to a neatly written signature. "Emily Brooks." The date was 8 days earlier. Beneath her name was another signature. "Patricia Brooks." My eyes remained fixed on the page. Walter continued carefully. "They stayed for nearly 2 hours. Most people ask about horseback riding or hiking trails. They did not ask about any of that. They wanted to know how isolated the ranch was, whether deliveries arrived regularly, whether visitors usually stayed connected with family." A chill spread through me despite the warm morning sun. "Did they say why?" Walter looked uncomfortable. "The older woman did most of the talking. She said someone close to them needed complete privacy to recover. She also asked whether I respected people's personal space." I remembered Patricia sitting beside me at the hospital, smiling politely while telling doctors she only wanted what was best for Emily. I remembered every conversation where she gently suggested postponing the wedding until my health improved. At the time, her concern had sounded reasonable. Standing there with Walter, those same memories began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to solve. Walter folded the clipboard closed and rested one hand on my shoulder. "Nathan, I do not know your family. I do not know what happened before you came here. But I have lived long enough to recognize the difference between someone seeking peace and someone arranging distance. Those are not always the same thing." I looked back toward the empty driveway where Emily had vanished less than 24 hours earlier. For the first time, I stopped waiting for an explanation that would make everything understandable. Instead, I began wondering how much of my future had already been decided before I ever climbed into her car. I could not stop thinking about the visitor log Walter had shown me. Emily had stood on this very property 8 days before bringing me here, and she had never mentioned it. That single fact quietly unraveled months of memories I had carefully filed away as misunderstandings, bad timing, or ordinary stress. Sitting alone on the farmhouse porch that afternoon, I found myself replaying the story of our relationship from the beginning, searching for the moment when love slowly gave way to something I had been too hopeful to recognize. I met Emily Brooks almost 3 years earlier at a neighborhood charity event in Denver. She was volunteering at the registration table, laughing with strangers as though she had known them for years. She had an easy kindness that made everyone around her feel welcome. We spent nearly an hour talking over paper cups of coffee after the event ended, discovering that we both loved hiking, small bookstores, and quiet weekends away from crowded cities. Our relationship grew naturally. We celebrated promotions, survived long work weeks, and dreamed about building a family together someday. When I proposed during a weekend trip to Rocky Mountain National Park, she cried before I even finished asking the question. For a long time, I believed that moment would remain the happiest memory of my life. Then I met Patricia Brooks. At first, she treated me with flawless politeness. She complimented my career, praised my manners, and insisted that Emily had found someone dependable. Looking back now, I realize her approval always came with careful conditions. She often reminded Emily that life rarely unfolded according to plan and that practical decisions mattered more than emotional ones. At the time, I assumed she was simply a protective mother. After my illness, those conversations slowly changed. Patricia began visiting our apartment more often than before. She arrived carrying homemade meals, organizing cabinets that did not need organizing, and speaking in the calm, confident voice of someone who believed she understood every situation better than everyone else. She never criticized me directly. Instead, she filled every conversation with quiet doubts. She asked Emily whether she was prepared to become a caregiver instead of a wife. She wondered aloud how many years recovery might take. She questioned whether postponing the wedding would be the responsible choice. Emily always defended me in the beginning. She would squeeze my hand beneath the dinner table and remind her mother that we were facing the challenge together. I remember feeling grateful every time she stood beside me. But over the following weeks, those reassuring gestures became less frequent. Emily stopped talking about wedding plans. The unopened invitation samples remained stacked neatly on the dining room shelf. Our conversations shifted from choosing flowers and music to insurance paperwork, medical appointments, and financial uncertainty. Whenever Patricia visited, Emily grew quieter afterward. Sometimes she stared out the apartment window for long stretches without saying a word. If I asked what was bothering her, she always smiled politely and said she was simply tired. I believed her because trusting the person you love feels easier than questioning every silence. One evening, about a month before we came to Montana, I overheard part of a phone conversation as Emily stood on the balcony. She did not know I had stepped into the kitchen. I heard Patricia's voice through the speaker, clear enough to recognize, but not every word. Emily answered softly, saying, "I know, Mom. I just need more time." When she walked back inside and saw me, she ended the call immediately. I asked whether everything was all right. She smiled, kissed my forehead, and said her mother was worrying too much as usual. I accepted the explanation without another question. Sitting on the ranch porch now, that memory no longer felt harmless. Neither did the dozens of small moments that followed. Emily had begun canceling appointments with our wedding planner. She quietly removed brochures for honeymoon destinations from the coffee table. She even suggested that perhaps a long period away from the city would help me recover emotionally as well as physically. At the time, I thought she was trying to protect me from stress. Now I could not ignore the possibility that every conversation had been guiding me toward this isolated ranch, one careful step at a time. As the afternoon sun slipped lower across the fields, I realized something even more painful than being abandoned. The plan had not been created overnight. It had unfolded slowly, hidden beneath smiles, gentle voices, and promises that sounded compassionate. That was the hardest truth to accept. Betrayal rarely arrives wearing anger. Sometimes it arrives dressed as concern, speaking softly enough that you do not recognize it until the road home has already disappeared behind you. I slept very little that night. Every memory I had trusted now seemed to carry a second meaning, as though someone had quietly rewritten my past while I was too distracted to notice. Early the next morning, I found Walter repairing an old tractor beside the equipment shed. He looked up as I approached, studied my expression for a moment, and quietly set his tools aside without asking unnecessary questions. We sat on two weathered wooden chairs outside the barn while the sun slowly climbed over the hills. After several minutes of silence, Walter spoke first. "You are carrying something heavier than your suitcase, son." I let out a tired laugh. "I think I have been carrying it for months. I just did not know it." Walter nodded as though he understood exactly what I meant. He disappeared into the barn and returned holding a small metal cash box. From inside, he removed several folded receipts and handwritten notes. "I almost threw these away," he admitted. "Then something told me to keep them." He handed me a receipt dated 8 days before my arrival. It showed a payment made by Patricia Brooks for a month-long stay at the farmhouse, along with several special requests. Private accommodations, minimal interruptions, limited scheduled visitors, flexible meal deliveries. My hands tightened around the paper. "She paid for all of this?" I asked quietly. Walter nodded. "She insisted on paying in advance." She also told me the guest needed complete isolation to recover from emotional stress. I believed her because nothing about the request seemed unusual at the time. He reached into the box again and unfolded another piece of paper. This one contained Patricia's neatly written contact information along with instructions to call her before contacting anyone else if any unexpected situation developed. I stared at the page in disbelief. My own emergency contact had never been listed. Neither had my brother Daniel, who had always been the first person I trusted during difficult times. Patricia had quietly positioned herself between me and everyone else. Walter watched my reaction carefully before speaking again. I am sorry, Nathan. If I had known the whole story, I would have asked many more questions. I shook my head. You were given a story that sounded believable. So was I. We sat in silence until Walter finally asked the question I had been avoiding. Did Emily know about these arrangements? I wanted to answer immediately. I wanted to defend the woman I had loved for nearly 3 years. Instead, I remembered the visitor log, the 6-hour drive filled with uncomfortable silence, and the envelope containing my medication schedule that she had prepared before we even reached the ranch. Too many details had required planning. Too many decisions had been made long before we arrived. I think she knew, I admitted softly. Saying those words out loud felt strangely different from merely thinking them. They settled over me with the quiet weight of acceptance rather than anger. Walter leaned back in his chair and looked toward the distant hills. There is something I learned after my wife passed away, he said. People rarely change overnight. Most of the time, they simply stop hiding who they have become. His words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. That afternoon, I decided to use the farmhouse landline instead of relying on my useless cell phone. I dialed Emily's number from memory. The phone rang 4 times before the call went to voicemail. I left a calm message asking only one question. Did you know your mother arranged all of this before we arrived? I did not accuse her. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked for the truth. Hours passed without an answer. As evening settled across the ranch, the landline finally rang. My heart raced as I hurried to the kitchen. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number. When I answered, there was only a brief pause before Patricia's unmistakably calm voice filled the room. Nathan, she said, almost pleasantly. I was hoping we could have a mature conversation. Emily is very emotional right now, and I think it is better if you and I speak directly. I gripped the receiver more tightly, but remained silent. Patricia continued in the same composed tone. You need to understand that sometimes love is not enough. Emily deserves stability, certainty, and a future without constant uncertainty. I simply helped her see what she was too kind to admit. There was no anger in her voice. No guilt. Only quiet confidence, as though she believed she had solved a difficult problem. Before I could respond, she added one final sentence that echoed through the silent farmhouse long after the line went dead. The longer you stay where you are, Nathan, the easier it will be for everyone to move forward. After Patricia ended the call, I remained standing beside the kitchen counter with the receiver still in my hand. The farmhouse was completely silent again, yet something inside me had changed. Until that moment, I had been waiting for an apology, an explanation, or some sign that everything had been a terrible misunderstanding. Patricia had taken that hope away with a few calm sentences. She had not sounded frightened or uncertain. She sounded convinced that my future had already been decided. Oddly enough, that certainty became the very thing that set me free. The following morning, I woke before sunrise and stepped outside into the cool Montana air. The sky glowed with shades of orange behind the distant hills, while dew covered the tall grass like tiny crystals. Walter was already walking toward the barn, carrying 2 empty buckets. Without saying much, he handed one to me. We spent the next hour feeding the horses that boarded on neighboring property and checking the fences after a windy night. The work was slow and uncomplicated, but every step reminded me that my body was stronger than it had been only a week earlier. Recovery had not stopped simply because someone believed I should disappear. Recovery had continued quietly every single day. Walter noticed it before I did. You are breathing easier, he said as we walked back toward the farmhouse. Your shoulders are not carrying the same weight. I smiled faintly. I still have questions. Questions are healthy, he replied. Just do not let them become chains. Those words stayed with me throughout the day. Instead of sitting inside replaying old conversations, I began helping Walter with small jobs around the ranch. I organized tools in the workshop, repaired loose shelves inside the farmhouse, and even walked the gravel road for nearly a mile without needing to stop and rest. My doctor had always encouraged gentle movement during recovery, and for the first time I realized that the ranch itself was helping me heal in ways no hospital room ever could. That afternoon, I finally called my younger brother Daniel using the landline. His voice answered almost immediately, filled with relief and confusion. "Nathan, where have you been? I have been trying to reach you for days." I explained everything as calmly as I could, from the drive to Montana to Patricia's phone call. Daniel remained silent until I finished. "Something never felt right," he admitted. "Emily canceled dinner with me twice during the past month. She kept saying you needed privacy, but every time I asked to visit, she had another excuse." He paused before adding, "There is something else you should know. Patricia contacted your apartment manager 3 days ago, asking whether your lease would be ending soon. She said she was helping you prepare for a permanent lifestyle change." I closed my eyes as another piece of the puzzle settled into place. They had been making plans without ever including me in them. Daniel offered to drive to Montana that very weekend, but I asked him to wait. "I am safe here," I said honestly. For the first time in a long while, I actually believed that. After the call ended, I carried my engagement photograph out to the porch. I studied the smiling faces frozen inside the frame for several long minutes before quietly placing it inside the bottom drawer of the living room cabinet. I did not throw it away. I simply accepted that it belonged to a different chapter of my life. As evening settled over the ranch, Walter joined me on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. We watched a small herd of deer move across the distant pasture while the setting sun painted the fields with soft golden light. Finally, Walter broke the silence. "You know," he said, "most people think healing begins when the pain disappears. I have found that healing really begins the moment you stop waiting for the person who caused the pain to come back and fix it." I looked across the endless Montana landscape and realized I was no longer counting the hours since Emily had left. I was counting the quiet victories that had followed instead. Somewhere beyond those hills, Patricia still believed distance would erase me from Emily's life. What she did not understand was that distance was slowly returning something I had almost lost completely. It was giving me back the ability to trust my own judgment. And once a person finds that again, they become much harder to control than anyone ever expects. 3 days passed with a rhythm I had almost forgotten was possible. Important was healing beneath the surface. I no longer reached for my phone every few minutes hoping to see Emily's name. I no longer imagined elaborate explanations that could somehow erase what had happened. Acceptance had arrived quietly, and with it came a sense of peace that surprised even me. Late on the 4th afternoon, while Walter and I were repairing a section of split-rail fence near the entrance to the ranch, I heard the unmistakable sound of tires rolling across the gravel road. Both of us looked toward the gate. A familiar gray sport utility vehicle slowly came into view before stopping beside the weathered mailbox. For several long seconds the engine continued running. Then the driver's door opened. Emily stepped out alone. She looked different from the woman who had driven away only days earlier. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and the confidence she had worn during our final drive had completely disappeared. She spotted me standing beside the fence and froze where she was. Neither of us moved. Walter quietly placed his tools on the ground, looked at me once, and without saying a word walked back toward the barn, leaving us the privacy to face each other. Emily approached slowly until only a few feet separated us. She opened her mouth several times before any words came out. "Nathan," she whispered, "I have been trying to find the courage to come back." I studied her face carefully. There were tears in her eyes, but I had learned that tears alone did not always reveal the truth. "You knew where I was the entire time," I answered calmly. "Finding me was never the difficult part." She lowered her head. "You are right." The silence between us stretched across the quiet pasture. Finally, she took a slow breath and looked directly at me. "I made the biggest mistake of my life." I did not respond immediately. A week earlier, those words would have shattered every wall around my heart. Now they simply hung in the cool afternoon air, waiting for meaning. "Why are you here?" I asked. Emily folded her hands together as though searching for strength. "Because everything has fallen apart." I waited. "My mother told me that giving you space would help everyone." She said you needed time away from the pressure of the city and that you would eventually understand why we postponed the wedding. She promised that once you recovered we could talk honestly. She stopped speaking and shook her head. But that was not her real plan. I remembered Patricia's calm voice on the telephone telling me the longer I stayed away, the easier it would be for everyone else to move forward. Emily continued before I could interrupt. After I left you here, she started asking me to cancel more things. She wanted me to return the wedding deposits, remove your name from future plans, and tell our friends that we had simply grown apart. Every conversation became another step toward pretending you no longer existed in my life. She wiped away a tear. That was when I finally realized she never expected us to find our way back. I listened quietly, refusing to let sympathy replace judgment. Did you know she arranged everything before we arrived? Emily closed her eyes. I knew she booked the ranch. I believed she wanted you somewhere peaceful while you recovered. I did not know she had spoken to Walter the way she did. I did not know she tried to control who could contact you. By the time I understood how far she had gone, I was too ashamed to admit that I had helped her. I looked across the wide Montana fields before answering. Emily, the hardest part was never being left here. The hardest part was realizing that every time you had the chance to trust me, you trusted someone else instead. She covered her face for a moment, unable to deny what I had said. When she finally looked up again, her voice was barely audible. I do not expect forgiveness today. I only wanted you to hear the truth from me instead of someone else. I nodded once. Then tell me everything. This time, leave nothing out. Emily and I sat on the old wooden bench outside the farmhouse until the evening sun slipped behind the hills. Neither of us hurried the conversation. For the first time in months, there were no carefully chosen words, no polite excuses, and no attempts to protect someone else's feelings. There was only the truth. Emily stared at the fading light before quietly admitting that her mother had spent weeks convincing her that our future together would become a lifetime of sacrifice. Patricia repeatedly told her that love could not survive endless doctor appointments, financial uncertainty, and the emotional weight of caring for someone whose recovery had no guaranteed timeline. At first, Emily argued. She reminded her mother that I had always supported her dreams and that illness did not erase a person's worth. But Patricia never argued loudly. She simply repeated the same fears day after day until they began sounding like facts instead of opinions. Emily confessed that she slowly stopped trusting her own judgment and started borrowing her mother's instead. The final push came when Patricia insisted that time apart would reveal whether our relationship was truly meant to last. Emily believed she was giving me space to heal. She never realized her mother had already begun erasing me from every future plan. I listened without interrupting because none of what she said changed what had happened. Understanding the path that led someone to betray your trust does not erase the betrayal itself. Emily reached into her purse and carefully removed a thick envelope. She handed it to me with trembling hands. Inside were copies of canceled wedding reservations, emails between Patricia and several vendors, and printed messages showing that my apartment lease had been discussed without my knowledge. There were also conversations in which Patricia instructed Emily to delay responding to my calls, avoid discussing future plans, and gradually separate our lives so that the ending would appear natural to everyone around us. My chest tightened as I read each page. None of the messages contained anger or cruelty. They were written with calm, practical language that treated the end of our relationship like a business project rather than the collapse of two lives that had once planned to become one. Emily quietly admitted that she had printed everything after discovering Patricia had already contacted a real estate agent about helping her move into a new condominium once our engagement officially ended. That discovery finally shattered the illusion she had believed for months. Her mother had never been protecting her. She had simply been directing every decision until Emily no longer recognized which thoughts were truly her own. Walter approached the porch just as darkness settled across the ranch. He did not ask questions. He simply placed 3 cups of fresh coffee on the small table before us and took a seat nearby. After listening quietly to the conversation, he spoke with the same steady calm that had guided me since my arrival. "The truth has a strange way of arriving," he said. "Sometimes it comes too late to save what was lost, but it always arrives early enough to save the person willing to learn from it." Emily lowered her eyes. "I do not expect Nathan to forgive me," she said softly. I barely know how to forgive myself. Walter nodded kindly. Forgiveness is never something you ask another person to give on your schedule. It begins when you stop making excuses for your own choices. Emily accepted those words without argument. For the first time since I had known her, she did not look towards someone else for reassurance. She simply accepted responsibility. I gathered the papers, placed them neatly back inside the envelope, and looked across the quiet Montana fields that had become unexpectedly meaningful to me. Just days earlier, I had arrived believing this ranch was the place where my life had been abandoned. Now I realized it had become the place where every illusion had quietly fallen away. The future I once imagined was gone, but for the first time I could finally see the road ahead without someone else deciding where it should lead. The following morning, I loaded my suitcase into Daniel's truck while the first rays of sunlight stretched across the Montana fields. Walter stood beside the porch with his hands tucked into the pockets of his old work jacket, wearing the quiet smile of someone who understood that some goodbyes did not need many words. I walked over and thanked him for everything he had done, but he gently shook his head. "You did the hard part yourself," he said. "I only gave you a place where you could hear your own thoughts again." Before leaving, I handed him the spare key to the farmhouse. For a brief moment, I looked back at the front porch where I had once stood believing my life had ended. Now I realized it had simply changed direction. As Daniel drove us toward Denver, I watched the wide Montana landscape slowly disappear in the rearview mirror. Instead of sadness, I felt something I had not experienced in many months. I felt peaceful. During the drive, I made several decisions that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. I contacted my employer and explained that I was ready to continue my recovery while gradually returning to work. My manager welcomed me back with more kindness than I expected and assured me that my position had always been waiting. I also canceled every remaining wedding arrangement that still carried my name. There was no anger behind those calls, only acceptance. A few days later, Emily asked if we could meet one final time at a quiet park near the river where we had often walked together. She arrived carrying the engagement ring in a small velvet box. She placed it gently on the bench between us without trying to hand it directly to me. "I know I cannot repair what I broke," she said softly. "I only wanted you to know that I finally understand what happened. I allowed someone else's fears to become my own decisions, and I lost the person who trusted me most." I listened carefully before answering. "Emily, I believe you regret what happened. I also believe that regret and trust are not the same thing. Trust is built one choice at a time, and it can disappear the same way." She nodded with tears in her eyes, but did not argue. She thanked me for listening and quietly walked away. I left the ring on the bench for a few moments before placing it back inside the velvet box. Later that afternoon, I donated its value to a local organization that helped families facing long medical recoveries. It felt like the right way to close a chapter that had taught me so much about strength, dignity, and hope. Several weeks later, Walter mailed me a small package. Inside was the framed engagement photograph I had left in the farmhouse drawer. Tucked behind the frame was a handwritten note. "Keep the picture if it reminds you of who you once were. Put it away if it reminds you of who you almost became. Either way, never forget that your future is still waiting." I smiled as I folded the note and placed it inside my desk. I removed the photograph from its frame, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because I no longer needed to live inside it. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest loss was never the broken engagement. It was the period of my life when I stopped trusting my own voice because I believed someone else understood my future better than I did. The ranch that once felt like a place of abandonment became the place where I found clarity. Walter reminded me that kindness still existed. Daniel reminded me that real family stays close even when distance separates them. Emily taught me that good intentions cannot replace personal responsibility. And Patricia, without ever intending to, taught me the most important lesson of all. Anyone can influence your path for a while, but only you decide which direction your life will finally take. Today my health continues to improve, my work has purpose again, and each new morning feels less like recovering from what I lost, and more like discovering what was waiting for me all along. Some people walk out of your life believing they have taken your future with them. The truth is that sometimes they simply leave enough space for you to build a better one.